You know what I have a love-hate relationship with? This hair. On the one hand, it's kind of energetic and kind of me. On the other hand, it's a bit too poofy and sometimes the hair just kind of goes all over the place. I had a haircut recently and sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't like it. Just like these 5 stories I'm about to mention. Hello, God bless you all, Scotch Meyer here, and welcome to a unique list that I need to get out my chest. Ow! Not like that! I'm sorry, Scriff, I know I'm not a joke person, but I couldn't stay mad at you. Are you a media lover? Do you ever come across a story of some kind, whether it be in a book or in a video game or a film or a television series or whatever, and you're really invested in it, but at the same time there's some really, really stupid parts about it, but there's something about it that just keeps you pulling you back, even though there's something about it that keeps pushing you away? Like an abusive relationship? This is how I feel towards these following 5 stories. Just keep in mind that this list I'm about to compile is somewhat subjective, but at the same time, it's kind of objective because many people have had similar critiques towards the stories I'm about to mention. And I've seen most of these stories to their full capacity, and I'm going to critique these stories as a Scottish autistic Christian guy, as you do. So let's not waste any time. Here are the top 5 stories which I both love and hate at the same time. Let's begin with a recent example, The Rise of Skywalker. Now, I'm sure some of you have already know this already, but I actually loved The Last Jedi. Yeah, I know, crucify me, come at me, haters! And The Last Jedi is undoubtedly polarizing. Yet, when The Rise of Skywalker came, I don't really know if the stakes were raised as such. I think some of us were trying to tell others, okay, put your expectations down and maybe you'll enjoy this. Needless to say, The Rise of Skywalker was kind of disappointing. And I just need to take time to point out that part of it has to do with the toxic fan base. They've pretty much made Star Wars into this idol that they worship, and if there's anything that's even trying to be ambitious or trying to do something new, they'll just ridicule people who are trying to do something ambitious. That, combined with the studios trying to cash in on that sweet, sweet money, we got a big disjointed mess of studios trying to appeal to the fans, just rushing through certain plot points and having a few scenes that were kind of unnecessary, or some other scenes that should have had more attention being paid to, and other scenes that you don't know if it either works or it doesn't. It's a mess, but some people like me would argue that it's kind of a fun mess. I mean, come on, Rise of Skywalker isn't that bad. There was some awesome moments, there were some fantastic chase sequences, set pieces. The practical effects are amazing. I mean, say what you want about the film, but it's a visual spectacle. Everyone can agree on that. And it has some of the most epic moments in the Star Wars franchise. You could say that for the sequel trilogy in general. It's kind of dumb, but there are some moments in it that are just so well done. Like Kylo Ren, his character comes to a full arc, and it's a brilliant redemption arc. My friend Dr. Neiltopus admired Rey's character development in this film, which is quite interesting. And the reveal of her relatives, I don't know if that was a good decision or not, but on the one hand, it does raise the stakes. On the other hand, maybe it could have led to some more effective drama, I don't know. But they do play they do play around a lot with themes of faith and identity and redemption. And you can't go wrong with a bit of good defeating evil, eh? Another thing people critique this film for is that it's trying too hard to be like Endgame, which came out the same year. And all those ships flying in and then fighting all the battles, that should have felt so epic, but it just didn't quite reach the peak because the characters weren't as well defined. To be fair, they kind of have an unfair advantage because the Marvel Cinematic Universe had a full decade's worth of build-up. And the film itself had a great build-up, and there's even one or two deaths which are quite effective. There's a few moments which I think are they genuinely work. The moments with Palpatine are just pure cinematic awesomeness. And I had a fun time, but there was also one or two things where I just went, did they really do that? Are they really that stupid? Okay, spoiler alert. So, after the big finale, Rey and Kylo Ren look at each other kind of romantically, and I was sitting there. I remember sitting there in the cinema with my friend, and I'm just saying to myself, "Don't kiss, don't kiss, don't kiss, don't kiss, don't kiss," and then they kiss, and I'm just sitting there, just closing my eyes, just But then immediately afterwards, Kylo Ren sacrificed himself, and then Leia passes on in peace, and I thought, wow, that's a really good part. And there's another kiss scene after that. I'm like, no, that was also dumb. And I was thinking, oh, next you're gonna tell me like Finn's gonna make out with Poe. Don't be getting any ideas. I've said too much, haven't I? And my friend Darth Potter 7, aka Will Santiago, is especially disappointed with this movie, especially as a Star Wars fan. And I can understand the disappointment. I can understand the hate, but there were some legitimately good parts in it. It wasn't all that bad. I think the main issue people had with this film was that it lacked a creator's vision. It felt very artificial. People love to mock the prequel trilogy, but nowadays they say at least it had the creator's vision, at least it had that passion. But here, this film should not suck. I mean, the studios are giving it they love Star Wars. And all the cast members, all the crew members, they're so sincere with their passion with Star Wars, but I think some of it got carried away by the studio wanting money. The Lighthouse. This is an independently made movie, I think, made by A24 under direction of Roger Edgers, I think his name is, who previously made the film Witch. The premise of the movie is that there are these two lighthouse keepers who have been hired to man the lighthouse for about 5 weeks. The younger one has a very troubled past and is seemingly trying to escape from something, whilst the older one in charge is a tad bit eerie and kooky and talks too much. There's a few supernatural events going on around this lighthouse island, and over the course of their work, both men are slowly driven to absolute insanity. And let me tell you, as a filmmaker, I highly admire just the sheer artistry of how much effort went into the filmmaking. This is some of the most cinematic filmmaking I have seen in a while. A part of me is very glad to have seen it in the big screen. To start off with, the entire film is shot in black and white to complement the uncomfortable dark atmosphere that they create. They chose a very specific square-framed camera to not only suit the time period, but to also give a sense of claustrophobia, which is a genius idea. And there is not a single part that is dull or boring. From the moment it starts, you're hooked onto the screen. The first 5 minutes has no dialogue whatsoever. It's just pure atmosphere and just getting to know the whereabouts of the place. Because it's quite breathtaking how much crazy stuff happens in this one location. The use of sound effects is also quite effective. There's the constant horn just blowing in the background. And throughout the first while of the movie, it's just blowing, and already you're kind of getting irritated. But it's sort of a good type of irritation because it's already making you uncomfortable, and you're already thinking, okay, they're gonna go mad if they stay on this lighthouse. And even though there's a few other actors, I love how this is mainly a two-man show, like a theater show. The performances from our two main leads are amazing, and they have some brilliant writing to work off with. It's like pirate Shakespeare. the Willem Dafoe character has some of the most amazing dialogues I've seen in cinema. Let Neptune strike ye dead, Winslow! Hark!
Let Neptune strike ye dead, Winslow!
That whole monologue was just wow. And the fact that he's letting Neptune curse Winslow with all their might over the mundane fact that Winslow didn't like his cooking. Yeah, this is actually quite funny at times. There's a scene where the two of them get drunk and they're going a bit mad, and then they're going wilder, and then it just rapidly cuts to them slowly dancing. And then they'll just have a brawl, and then it's quick cut to them just taking a break. And the writing does lend itself to some great character building. There's a scene... Some of it's quite obvious, but other times it's quite subtle, and it's building and building and building. Like there's a scene, for example, where Willem Dafoe character says, "Are you a praying man?" And then Winslow says, "I'm a God-fearing man, if that's what you're asking." They don't elaborate too much on that, but there's little scenes like that which are great for character building and setting up for later scenes. And there's some interesting analyzing you can do and comparing it to Greek mythology. So that's why I love The Lighthouse. I adore the filmmaking, but why do I hate it? Because it's absolutely disgusting! So basically, to keep things as suitable as possible, Winslow has a serious lust problem over this mermaid statue. And he always finds some time alone every night and fantasizes about being with the mermaid. And look, I get it. Winslow is a sinner with a serious problem, one of his main sins being lust. But come on, you could have shown it in a much more subtle or more tasteful way. I know the film's meant to be disgusting, but that's not an excuse to outright show us porn. Like, every time those sessions were happening, I had to turn away from the screen. It was that gross. Basically, if there was a censored version that would cut out all those porn scenes, yeah, I'm just calling them that, as well as cut out the foul language, I would have considered this a masterpiece. But if I were to watch it again, I would just insist on skipping those scenes. Roger Edgers, if you're watching this, I know you can do better than this. I know you could have found a more tasteful way to depict his issue with lust. But I did enjoy this film for this escalation of this struggle between power combined with the roughness of working in the lighthouse, combined with the supernatural things that are invading them, combined with the way they just can't tolerate each other. It's this circle of insanity that just keeps expanding and expanding. Like, near the end, they get so crazy, they don't even know what's real anymore. Willem Dafoe has this great monologue where he goes, "How long have we been on this rock? 5 weeks? 2 days? Help me to recollect." It's a very quotable movie. Also, the main reason I saw this film in the first place, the trailers were amazing, especially the second one released, where it wasn't as frantic, but it was really atmospheric, and it had that scene where they're going, what? It was intense and funny at the same time, but I think I've said enough about The Lighthouse. Do let me go. Number 3, and since I'm recording this on a fine, beautiful, God-blessed Sunday, I might as well mention my next story that I love and hate. And that is The Shack by Paul Young. Was it Paul Young or was it Sam Young, I think? I remember purchasing this at this Christian store back when I was having my job in Glasgow. I watched it on my own, And in my first viewing of it, I cried like a baby. It was pretty effective with being emotional. I even put it on my top 15 cry moments, but then, as I got more into my Bible studies, there was something off-putting about this film. There were other Christians who were pointing out that the shack is theologically flawed. So the more observant of you have probably noticed that I took down that made me cry moment from the list and made a link to someone describing why the shack is theologically inappropriate. So now thinking about it, on the one hand, the author has made a genuinely emotional story, and he is trying to get the point across that God is with you even when you're suffering. I admire that. But what I find suspicious now is the doctrine he made alongside with this story. Like, the shack contains all sorts of heresies, according to what I've heard. There's some false theological lessons on how God redeems all of humanity regardless of whether they repent or not. And I've heard rumors that the author doesn't believe in hell. What? They depict God listening to secular music. And there's a few other New Age elements been thrown in. Witchcraft and New Age thinking is not good for theology. And a doctrine of God submitting to human wishes? I'm sorry, William Paul Young is coming up with a completely different God here. He's worshipping what we dedicated Christians refer to as a teddy bear God. This sort of cuddly God who would never do harm to any person, even if they were the most horrendous person ever. He's clearly mixing a few things, so let me tell you the truth. Yes, God does love everybody. But here's the tragedy. Not everybody loves God. And not everyone's going to be dedicated to him. And people do terrible, terrible things. There must be punishment if they don't change their ways. That's the way courts of law work. Sin is part of the reason why Jesus died on the cross. Because no one's perfect, and the punishment for sin is death. That's how seriously God takes it. And yes, God did love us so much, he did send Jesus to die on the cross in our place, so we can have a chance to repent and go to heaven. But that's not an excuse to keep on sinning. And I apologize once again if I'm making you kind of uncomfortable, but this is a Christian film. Of course I'm going to have a religious talk over it. So the moment I found out about the heresies, I threw a copy of the film I had into the bin. And if you are going to watch this film, approach it with immense caution. So a part of me still likes the shack because I appreciate what the author was trying to say. But I hate the shack because of the way it said it. Sorry, as a Christian, it's my duty to point out false doctrines. Number 4, Cats the Musical. I love Andrew Lloyd Webber. He is a musical genius. Almost everything he touches in musical becomes a masterpiece. He has brought us Jesus Christ Superstar, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, Phantom of the Opera. Beloved musicals with epic stories. And Cats is quite intriguing. And no, I'm not going to talk about that movie that came out recently, because what is there to love about it? Tom Herbert, you can do better than that. You made Les Miserables a great film adaptation. So what is Cats all about? I can't really bother telling it because there's not much of a plot, which is one of the main issues with this musical. But at the same time, there are some friends of mine, including Chris, the director of the Reactaholics podcast, who have insisted that the musical is more of a character piece, where we're just looking at all these different characters interacting with each other, character analysis, and yeah, one could see it like that. And the fact that it's a spectacle musical, and it's not really focusing much on story, it's just focusing on spectacle just for the sake of it, like you would in a circus. And you know what? That's fine. Not every beautiful piece of art needs to have a coherent story. I mean, the Fantasia series works in that aspect. But then there is a little bit of a story. So therefore, a part of me just wishes they would have at least had a bit more character building, or maybe the characters are conquering personal obstacles as they all try to understand each other. Because there are some incredibly sympathetic characters in this musical. You got Old Deuteronomy, you got Gus the theater cat, you got Grisabella with memory, all alone in the concentrate. And even the most harshest critics will happily agree that they're going to walk away from the show with at least one song that they really liked. And there is a little bit of depth with some biblical themes with Old Deuteronomy, the fact that he's even called that, and his role as the leader as he chooses a cat to go to the heavenside layer for a chance of a redeemed new life. There's some insights you can go into there, and there's some nuanced ways you could analyze the characters. But even as a character piece, I think maybe they should have spent more time with the characters interacting with each other between the songs. I mean, they kind of spontaneously go from one character to the next between songs. I mean, the dancing and a whole visual set piece is incredibly well put together. But that also leads to my next personal issue, which is probably the more polarizing part of this musical. The way the actors act in said costumes. Here's what I can accept. Theatre is a place where you're putting down your expectations, you're expected to use your imagination more often. I know because I've worked in theatre quite often, and I love the way they move as cats. They're so smooth, and they're really moving that spine. They're purring, they're sort of moving about, prancing, dancing, pouncing, and scratching. But that's taken to an extreme, to the point of sexualizing it. And that's what makes it really uncomfortable to watch at times, especially as a family musical. Do you really want to introduce potential younglings? Introduce them to perversions? Do you want them to attempt to imitate your dance moves? You're making an example. It's a family musical. You just don't do sexy stuff for stuff that's aimed for all ages. They're too young for that. And even for some of the weirder members of the audience, they might get a bit put off because they're meant to be cats. And once again, my friend Will Santiago had a review of this musical on his Letterboxd website, and reading it, I think it's a perfectly good description of Cats the Musical. And you know what? As a theatre piece, despite how polarizing, sexualized it can be, it's not doing much harm, and it revolutionized Broadway musical as we know it, according to what I've heard. And it's impressive that it's apparently the 4th longest running show on Broadway, but it's a bit off-putting when you consider that the creator who made Cats the Musical also brought us far, far better structured shows like Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, Jesus Christ Superstar, and Phantom of the Opera, this well-beloved horror character that he reinvented with the whole redemption arc and adding much more depth to the character. And the songs are really good to listen to, but when they're all compiled together in the way that it does in the musical, it's kind of a mess. And again, I understand it's meant to be a spectacle piece. Not everything needs to have a cohesive story. But sometimes they'll just take too long to repeat something over and over again, like the Jellicle Cats song. Some of the times the cats can be a bit weirder and creepier than usual. So yeah, it's polarizing, but there's a lot to admire about it. At the end of the day, I can't fully hate it either, but I can't fully love it either. And the last one on this list is the anime Death Note. There are various forms of the story. There's been various live action adaptations. It's based on this manga book series, to be more elaborate. And there is the anime series, which a lot of people often go to, and the way I introduced myself to the series. And still in this phase of binge watching anime shows, and of course, see Death Note on the shelf, and it's just one of the most popular shows, really in depth, really great characters. It's like, all right, guess I'll watch it then. So I got it, purchased it, and I was hooked onto this show. It does an excellent job at hooking you in, but then there's some really stupid things that it kind of loses course during the end, and then by the ending, it kind of backstabs you with this piece of lore that makes the whole thing pointless. It's like a Japanese guy investing you in the story, only to stab you in the chest and then reveal how the story ends. You just think, yeah, thank you for telling us how the story ends, but did you really have to stab me in the chest? Okay, that's a bit extreme, but in order to make my point, I have to explain what Death Note is all about. The story of Death Note is that in Japan, there's this really bright, intelligent, yet bored high school student named Light Yagami. In Death Note, there's also a realm of these legendary Japanese Death Green Reaper gods known as Shinigami. One said Shinigami by the name of Ryuk is bored. One time, Ryuk accidentally, it might have been on purpose, but he accidentally drops his Death Note, which Light Yagami takes notice of. Light picks up the Death Note and notices its peculiar rules that it establishes. If anyone's name is written on this Death Note, they will die. There's various other sophisticated rules that go into how the Death Note works, but it generally revolves around the fact that if you write someone's name in it, they die. At first, Light is extremely shocked and filled with guilt that the notebook even works like that. But then he starts becoming corrupt with power, and he gives in to his evil side, and he uses the Death Note to commit genocide on all the criminals of the world. Then Ryuk shows up because touching the Death Note makes you see the Shinigami, and Ryuk has come to inform Light that the notebook now belongs to him, and Ryuk can't really do anything to support nor stop him. He's just hanging around, just giving Light some advice whenever he needs it. And Light Yagami is determined to become the god of the world. But of course, his evil doings are not going to go unnoticed. The entire police force go after Light Yagami, and Light becomes even more corrupt by killing anybody who gets in his way, even if they're innocent. This is when the police detectives call in L, one of the world's most brilliant minds, and few people know who L is or where he comes from, and almost nobody knows what his name is. So obviously, Light Yagami can't just simply write L on the notebook because that's not his real name. Or maybe it is his real name and it's not all of it. Either way, it's a code name. And a great battle of wits and intellect initiates. Will L find out who the identity of Kira, the Death Note owner, is and bring him to justice? Or will Light Yagami find out who L is and kill him? The battle begins! And the first 10 episodes of this series is amazingly well paced. That are the first 15 or so episodes. It's the first quarter. I was beginning to think there'd be a slow, gradual progression of Light's descent into evil, but nope, right from episode 1, we instantly realize that he's a good kid, but then he goes corrupt with power almost instantly in the episode. It's really good at knowing when to get straight to the point and when to take things slow, and when to introduce a new concept. The best parts of this show comes from this intellectual battle of wits. The tension is high and it grabs you in. You have to keep watching every episode to know what happens. I think the idea of L is absolutely genius. Just the idea of this pale young man who's rarely gone outdoors, has these big wide eyes with eyeshadow. He's always sitting like this. And he's always just speaking intellectually, very quietly, always sipping tea, having sugary substances, and he's always reading like this, and he's sitting like this, not because he wants to, because he chooses to. I loved watching this character when I saw this series, I must admit. To the point where I found myself sitting like that as I kept watching, and even after I finished watching this series, I just kind of picked up some of his traits. You could, like, read anyone like an open book. But then, during the middle segment, it kind of just goes... We're introduced to this new character, Misa. And basically, long story short, Lighthouse has to rescue her because she's part of his plan to take over the world. There's this elaborate scheme of him losing his memory just so it could make it seem like he's not really Kira. We get 10 whole episodes which kind of just feel like filler as they chase a new Death Note guy and then Light gets the notebook back, but when you think about it, he's kind of in the same position as he was when he began the plan, so it makes that middle segment all the more kind of pointless. I mean, I understand that this is probably a show trying its best to be clever, but maybe it was being a bit too clever or just not clever enough in some areas. But even with that said, I kept watching it anyway, and I don't think I want to spoil it that much for those of you who do want to watch it. Because even after the middle segment, half of it's still a bit of a waste of time, but the other half of it is still a great intellectual battle of wits. And there are some scenes that exploit women in a very uncomfortable way. But the ending, my goodness, the ending was extremely intense. I was on the edge of my seat like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Who's going to win? Who's going to win? Boom, 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 boom. And it was one of those rare scenes where overacting actually benefits the mood of the scene, with the guy going, delete, 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 delete! But then after that part, and near the very finale, there's this title card which establishes a piece of lore that just completely ruins the whole thing. What is that? Are you kidding me? So let me elaborate on this piece of lore that's established in Death Note. In the world of Death Note, when people die, they don't go to heaven or hell. They go to nothingness. In the world of Death Note, regardless if someone was completely innocent or the worst person ever, they're going to have the same fate in the death that Death Note depicts. And look, I get it. The creator of the series was making up his own mythologies with the Shinigami, and he was trying to philosophize about the concept of justice and morality. And look, I understand that all these made-up worlds for these stories need to have their own consistencies, but if I'm noticing something that's highly inconsistent, if I notice something that contradicts itself, I'm not gonna ignore it. Okay, I'm gonna address the creator now. You're essentially philosophizing that Light Yagami and all the other people who sided with him don't get punished for their misdeeds, and L and the police force are not going to get rewarded for trying to stop a megalomaniacal sociopath. And I know there's a debate between the fan base as to whether L or Light Yagami were the hero or the villain, but even that's meaningless if they share the same fate. And I don't care what you say about who's the hero or who's the villain. They made it fundamentally clear that Light Yagami is becoming corrupt with power in spite of his good intentions. Many bad people do things out of good intentions. They clearly depict Light Yagami as a villainous protagonist. And they clearly depict L as a heroic figure to the point of even establishing him as a Christ symbol. Oh yeah, did I mention there was a lot of Christian symbolism in this show? There's a lot of heavy Christian symbolism. Many would argue that Light Yagami is an anti-Christ figure, L's a Christ figure, the police force are the disciples, so on and so forth. They even have the apple eating symbolism. They even have a scene where L washes Light's feet. But all that is ultimately pointless because of this piece of lore that's established. And from what I heard, the author just added the symbolism in just because he thought it was cool. No, it doesn't work like that. If you're going to add in religious symbolism of it, it's got to have a purpose. But because of this piece of lore that you've established in the show, even with your philosophies on grey morality, the whole show is ultimately pointless. Because if there's no hope of judgment and reward, then what's the point in anything? In other words, I've invested so much time into the show only to have it mean nothing. Light Yagami's ambitions to become a god was for nothing. Elle's ambitions to stop him was also for nothing. Like, in this world that the author has made up, a poor innocent girl trapped in a dungeon her whole life would eventually get the same treatment as the world's worst terrorist. If the author is saying that justice doesn't ultimately matter, why is he focusing so much on morality and justice? Because if there is no punishment or no reward, then I guess Elle and the police force should start becoming chaotic terrorists as well. Make a mess of the whole place, do the most horrendous stuff ever. Like, harass little girls, there's gonna be no punishment for it. What kind of stupid message is that? Yes, Death Note is a fictional story by a certain author, but I believe that stories reflect the philosophies and personal opinions of the people making the stories. And I'm sorry, this is a terrible philosophy to live life by. And look, I'm fine with talking about bad people doing things for the right reasons. I'll even take time to talk about supposedly righteous people doing bad things for something good. But unless there's a purpose to all of it, unless these actions have an impact, it will ultimately mean nothing. Oh man. So, yeah, that was my rant about Death Note. I appreciate that it's a successful anime series, but it's got a terrible philosophy, as well as some pacing issues. So, I'll end this off with saying something truthful. Morality is not subjective up to opinions. If it was, anything goes. But morality is objective, and we know it in our hearts. When we do something wrong, we feel it in our conscience. It weighs on us. Makes us feel guilty. Even the most skeptical people say that there ought to be a right and there ought to be a wrong. But hold on a minute. When you imply that there's such a thing as evil, you're implying that there's such a thing as good. When you're implying that there's such a thing as good, you're implying that there's a standard above us. And you're implying that there ought to be justice. And let me tell you the truth. There will be divine justice and divine punishment in the end. And to finish this off with something truthful, I'd like to read to you the moral argument according to William Lane Craig. Objective moral values and duties do exist, and they are immaterial, by the way. Moral experience reveals this. Morality is not something that we invent, it's something we discover. Therefore, there had to be a moral lawgiver. Therefore, a higher power, God, wrote the rules for life. Sorry to go on a bit of a tangent there, but false philosophies bear bad fruits, but the right philosophies bear good fruits. So I had to go on the tangent there for the greater good. What are some stories that you have a love-hate relationship with? Whether it be in books, video games, films, or television, please let me know in the comments down below. And if you like this, I might just do a continuation of this. There's a few more I had in mind, but I think these 5 top the list of the love-hate relationship I have with these stories. Thank you all so much for watching, and keep safe, everybody.